The fatal blow was struck when the West put a knife to its own throat.
We wanted a disarmed and defenseless Europe because an armed Europe was a hell of a pain in the ass.
I served in NATO billets twice. Yeah, trust me, that's exactly how we wanted it.
Iran, Russia, and China are now formally in a tripartite pact. If that's not as big an enemy as the Soviet Union was, I don't know what else to tell you.
The Chinese have realized there's a great opening here because the Americans have forgotten how to be serious.
It's not just a matter of forgetting. It's deliberate, willful, purposeful, whole of government amnesia. People really have to get their heads around that to fully comprehend what a behemoth we're dealing with.
If you're China, you know that you militarily can't defeat the US military, but what you can do is you can exacerbate intra-elite conflict until the debt bubble bursts, and then the US will no longer be able to pay for its military, and then you can stroll into Taiwan for pennies on the dollar. This is the plan.
The danger is the US deficit.
If we're conducting an autopsy here, I think the post-mortem would have to conclude that the fatal blow was struck when the West put a knife to its own throat by admitting China to the World Trade Organization in December of 2001. A few years later, Russia was admitted. The compromises between the IMF and China and Russia, which are ongoing, by the way. In 2024, Russia almost was completely renormalized within the IMF if it weren't for the protests of several European countries. It's been a gradual deterioration that has been permitted or occluded by the promises of wealth and the extension of various Western countries' supply chains into primarily Russia and China, to some extent Iran and other police states. To my view, the thing to pay attention to is that you cannot have free trade between free peoples and police states. This will not end well. Prime Minister Carney, and specifically the Canadian Liberal Party, represents the very malign influence in global affairs that has undermined the liberal rules-based order and has profited by undermining the liberal rules-based order. And what we saw in Davos was in many ways a repeat of what we saw during the first Trump administration with Justin Trudeau. Trump is a vulgar individual. He's repellent to people of manners, apart from everything else. And there's a lot else. So when Justin Trudeau was elected, it was almost like a bomb, particularly among American liberals. He was cheered on at the World Economic Forum. He was called the leader of the free world. He was on the cover of Rolling Stone. A similar effect is occurring now. Everybody wants an anti-Trump, an alternative to Trump. And people have gone a bit fanboy about Mark Carney. And I think it is desperately and dangerously misguided.
We treated the order as if it was a free good that didn't have maintenance costs. The parents of the baby boomers were so determined to shield them from the awfulness that they had gone through that they wanted their children to believe that this was just the natural order of things. So when Barack Obama says the arc of history bends towards justice, that is thermodynamically incorrect. This is the great liberal delusion. So I don't view the failure of the liberal order as something so much to do with Russia or China, although that's certainly symptomatic of it. We failed to understand the underpinnings because it had been around for so long. It was just the air we breathe. We just assumed it was free. Then we started chipping away at it, telling ourselves that was progress.
Do we think that the liberal world order requires the presence of the United States acting as a benevolent hegemon, or can it operate without the United States?
Yes, of course, there could be a liberal international order without the United States. It would be painful, it would be awful, but it's not like it can't be done. The Ukrainians have been doing it. They've managed to persist without the assistance of the United States. In fact, in the face of a great deal of unhelpful mischief being played by the White House. I don't want to suggest that it's merely a matter of China and Russia undermining the rules, but rather the class of peoples, the Gerhard Schroders in the West, the power corporations, the Witkoffs of the West that have been most responsible for pulling things apart and knocking the stuffing out of everything that our grandparents achieved in 1945. Part of the difficulty may be a generational thing. A lot of people just don't have a European memory, shall we say. It's not just because of multiculturalism and immigration. It's a generational thing. And it's a way of looking at the world. And I do agree with the observation that we've taken it for granted. We imagine that the arc of history is bending this way. We can sit back and watch this thing called history bend. It's often observed that Canada and other European countries have been free riders in NATO. I don't think that's particularly fair. We're all going to be free riders in the context of the United States. The amount of money that the Americans spend on defense is just over the top. It maintains this military system that is unlike anything in history. But the Americans treated NATO militaries as the ladies' auxiliary of the 82nd Airborne Division. And you do that for a while, and sooner or later, people are going to start acting like the ladies' auxiliary of the 82nd Airborne
It's
Division.
a very important point, and it's one that this administration does not seem to understand at all. We wanted a disarmed and defenseless Europe because an armed Europe was a hell of a pain in the ass. It was one of our great accomplishments to achieve a pacifistic Germany. We certainly didn't want a competitive power in Europe. We wanted Europe to be subordinate to us. And we wanted Europe to be buying our military products to lengthen our production lines and for our balance of trade. And it's only Trump. Obama fetched about it a little bit, but Trump has turned this into a cause that Europe is a freeloader.
That is absolutely the way we wanted it. I'm American. I served in NATO billets twice. Yeah, trust me, that's exactly how we wanted it. And Trump's such an idiot. He'll never understand that. He also will never understand that despite that, this wasn't the late Delian League. Everybody did something. When we were in Iraq, one of my former bosses, Mike Jones, retired 2-star now, he made the comment, I remember, to somebody once. He said, when you go by those Tongans, because the nation of Tonga had 65, I think, soldiers there. He said, make sure you thank them for being here. He says, because that's 65 places where we don't have to have U.S. soldiers pulling guard or doing this. And we can be doing other things that maybe other people can't, whatever. Everybody matters. And those contributions, yes, compared to us, they aren't so great, but they absolutely matter. And they're absolutely real things.
And on top of it, it all revolves around us so that we are the ones who have bases around the world.
Right.
No one else does.
And yes, you get these asymmetries, like when NATO countries were starting to send expeditionary forces to Afghanistan. This is the first time I was in Romania in late 2001. It was eye-opening that the only other force that self-deployed in those early days was Romania because they owned a couple C-130. They weren't even in NATO yet.
That's why they
And
did.
even the Brits needed us to stop by with C-17s and let them get on so that we could take them there. So you realize then it might be useful if some of these partners maybe had some strategic lift and things. Of course, sure. But those are just details. Those are not, oh, it's freeloading and it's broken. It's nonsense.
One of the things that we forget about the North American Free Trade Agreement, about CUSMA, Canada, US, Mexico Agreement, is the Americans wanted it this way. This is what you guys wanted. You wanted this.
Yes.
You wanted this.
And we forced you to renegotiate.
Exactly. And that's happening again. And I don't think any of us here would dispute the proposition that there is some serious sociopathology occupying the White House at the moment.
Quite key to what we're talking about, because the only reason
It
we're
is.
talking about
It is.
destruction of the international order is because something has happened in the past year that has caused everyone to say this order is over. What
Right, so-
parts of the order are over and whether it's permanent are the questions I think we're here to debate.
If you look at opinion polls in the United States, if you look at the positions adopted by the governors of the states that Canada does trade with, if you look at the recent vote in the Congress to withdraw the emergency powers that Trump has used to impose all of these tariffs on Canada. The Americans are not our enemies. Americans are not the problem here. They are in a way. Americans gone a bit nuts.
The fixation on Trump being a madman actually distract. I prefer to view him as an effect, not a cause.
Yeah.
Right to be thinking in terms of things that are much bigger than Trump, in terms of institutions that are no longer fit for purpose, in terms of large structures that have changed. For example, the structure of the global economy, which is a major change.
What held the Western order together to a great extent until the Soviet Union fell was the common enemy. And that common enemy is not there. It's there, but it's not as ominous as it used to be.
It's the perception of a common enemy rather than the reality of it. If people were really thinking, they'd realize we do indeed have common enemies and they're more dangerous than the Soviet Union was in many ways.
Perhaps the utility of the Cold War was like a cordon sanitaire between the West and its adversaries, industrial scale propaganda campaigns that we've been reading about today, thanks to Terry's work, couldn't really function, not that well. And maybe there was a bit more clarity, not in Latin America, not in Southeast Asia, but at least Americans could have a certain clarity of purpose that has completely disappeared. There was complete chaos and confusion mentally, it seems, in the West. First of all, in the White House, but that's emanating to other places. So is the Cold War useful?
Creating a unity in the West.
Yeah, and to maintain the unity of the liberal international order.
Well, so many norms were upheld because we needed to counter charges of hypocrisy from the Soviet Union. We knew that if we didn't think about civil rights, for example, that this looked really bad. That's not an international norm, but it's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. But again, it may be that we perceived that we had a common enemy at the time, but not surprise any of us if history had gone in such a direction so that we looked now at China as the common enemy and Russia as China's ally. Indeed, this axis of disruption and revisionism, China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and Iran, Russia, and China are now formally in a pact, a tripartite pact. If that's not as big an enemy as the Soviet Union was, I don't know what else to tell you. We could be saying, look, we've got major problems and we're facing extensive existential risk. We've got to all pull together here. So I don't think it's so much that there was an enemy as that we no longer have the perception of an enemy. And that's interesting.
The other thing is mutually assured destruction guaranteed a certain stability that otherwise is a historical anomaly, in that so much of the gamesmanship of international order is an entity believing it can get ahead, or this is its moment, or we are China. You have two very powerful entities that realize I can't win or win outright. Now you have more entities that are thinking we're going to get ahead here, or this isn't in our interests. So you have less coherence, and you have other powers are rising. India is rising. China has been rising for decades. There isn't this asymmetry of raw power that there used to be either. And by the way, the generational argument, forgetting, look at vaccines, right? Why is there a vaccine issue in America? Because people think diseases just don't exist anymore. The lack of civics education in America. We gave up even trying to educate our populace.
I've been thinking about this recently. I think that it was catastrophic to allow our manufacturing to be offshored, because I think that manufacturing kept a lot of people who weren't good at academic learning tethered to the material world and just practical realities. And I think that was important for the way people's brains worked.
But the Cold War, it's true that there was mutually assured destruction, but people forget there was seriousness on the part of the West to stop the Soviet Union from getting technology. Good example, I was in the computer industry. I remember the Soviets using the diplomatic pouch to transport personal computers from West Germany to East Germany. We really went a great distance to deny the Soviet Union technology. We cared. There was a seriousness. We really had to move on a variety of fronts to counter the Soviet Union. And we lost that. We regained the seriousness a bit after 9/11. Whatever you want to say about Bush and whether he made mistakes, but there was a seriousness of purpose after that. That dissipated, and we've lost it. And you saw with Obama, whether it's Syria or the way he negotiated with Iran on weapons, it wasn't serious. We'll take climate change. We go to Paris to negotiate climate change, and we allow The Chinese, all these exemptions, we walk away proud with a great agreement that does nothing. We do these things all over the place, agreements that do nothing, that we don't care, we're not serious. And the Chinese have realized there's a great opening here because the Americans have forgotten how to be serious.
Do you think we've forgotten how to be serious because it is impossible to transmit certain memories beyond 2 or 3 generations? Or do you think that it is because the institutions that we're using are no longer fit for purpose?
It's not just a matter of forgetting. It's deliberate, willful, purposeful, whole of government amnesia. Really think people need to get their heads around this. The Liberal government that was elected in 2025 was largely a function of the Canada-China Business Council and McKinsey and Associates. They wrote the whole platform. Justin Trudeau was elected for the purpose of building what he himself called a post-national state that had no core identity. The only thing to remember about Canada and Canada's history was that Canada was a racist, sexist, Islamophobic hellhole before he came along. I really think it's important for people to understand the animus and the hostility that a generation of people who we, I think, wrongly identify as liberals set about the work of completely deconstructing this notion that something grand and worthwhile was built and that our parents and grandparents shed blood over, that something worth defending emerged from the ashes of the Shoah, and it was necessary to defend it. The difference, of course, between the Cold War period and the Canadian example, there are American and certainly lots of European examples. We didn't have to worry about the Chinese Communist Party back in the day. We didn't have to worry about 14 or 15, according to Jean Chrétien, the former prime minister, who laughs about it and says, I don't think it's much to worry about. 14 or 15 ridings across Canada where you will not be able to be elected to the school board if the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office prefers that you not be elected to the school board. On Friday, there was a report issued by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It was actually work done by the Jamestown Foundation in the United States. More than 2,000 United Front Work Department organizations in Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. 540 something, I think, of them were in Canada. The largest overseas investment in the history of the Chinese Communist Party was that Sina took over Nexon in the Calgary oil patch. We have senators in Ottawa who are completely and utterly compromised, and they make no apologies for it. That's something that we didn't have to deal with in the Cold War. And when I talk about this, to a lot of people who are unfamiliar with these issues, I fear I must sound alarmist, and I worry about that, but I don't know what else to do except bear witness to it. And I do also admit my bias, and I do have a bias. And my bias is with Hong Kongers, with Uyghurs, with Ukrainians, with the Rohingyas. That's where I think actually the West's bias used to be. So it's a very disorienting world that we're living in. But I'm not hopeless. Paradoxically, I think it's because I have a greater hope in the United States of America and the American people than a lot of Americans have in themselves.
What's the mechanism China's using to compromise Canadian politicians? Is it money? Is it compromat? What's their leverage?
It's multifaceted. I look at the work of the United Front Work Department, which is the primary instrument, right? It's a function of the Chinese People's Consultative Conference, and it directed out of the Comintern, the Central Committee, the Politburo. And it's run out of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office of the embassy and all the consulates. It is complex. It's a hybrid kind of warfare. It's been studied fairly closely. Another thing that's very difficult to discuss, very sensitive. My people were immigrants, right? Sort of Irish, British, it's a long story. We emigrated into the Cantonese community. I'll put it that way. It's the easiest way of understanding my background. And the Chinese who built this country, the Chinese who built the railroads, the Chinese who toiled in the mines are not the Chinese that we have in Canada now. The Americans have no conception, it seems to me, of how much Canada has changed, particularly after Trump 1 was elected. Justin Trudeau said Canada is open, and Canada was open. You guys think you've got an immigration issue? You have no idea. You have no idea. There's 41 million Canadians. 8 million of those Canadians, they don't have Canadian citizenship. Most of those people are either foreign students or they're on any number of provincial and federal work permits. Also, the Chinese foreign student body in Canada produced, I think, 300,000 applications for refugee status just over the last, I think, 18 months. And it takes 42 weeks for an application to appear before the Immigration Review Board. The Chinese community in Canada is not the Chinese community in Canada that we need. Cantonese was the third most spoken language after English and French until quite recently. It's now Mandarin. There are 300,000 Canadian citizens on paper. They have Canadian passports in their investment portfolios in Hong Kong and China. If you're an American, multiply that by 10 if you want to apply it to the American situation. That's how China has come to wield this kind of influence. It does go back to Justin Trudeau's dad. He was arguably the most important propaganda asset in the Western world, possessed by the Chinese Communist Party for probably a quarter of a century. They grew up in this stuff, okay? It's the Canada-China Business Council. It's the Power Corporation. It's the Desmarais family. Jean Chrétien's son-in-law was the head of the Canada-China Business Council. The man who headed up Justin Trudeau's transition team was the executive director of the Canada-China Business Council. He was later appointed to the most senior Liberal position in the Senate. A close study of the way Beijing asserts its influence around the world, the Belt and Road program, and particularly Xi Jinping's conception of the community of the common destiny of humankind, is what he calls it. People really have to get their heads around that to fully comprehend what a behemoth we're dealing with. Also, look, China owns Russia. I've looked as closely as I can at the Iranian Shahed drones that are raining down on the people of Ukraine, and a significant number of them come from a factory in Tatarstan. There are rail lines going into that factory in the free trade zone in Tatarstan from China. It's an assembly plant. All I can do is try to describe what I see. Don't turn to me for any answers about how we get out of this, how we rebuild the architecture that our parents and grandparents shed blood for. I think the most important thing that people have to do is recognize exactly what we're up against here. What we perceive as American belligerence is a pretext, not a reason. Americans were nice to Canada when Obama was the president. And yet that's when the Liberal Party had its greatest successes in integrating Chinese business interests into the governing structure here. So you can be as nice to us as you want. It's not going to stop the Chinese business class from asserting its dominance in the oil patch and lately in the automotive sector.
India see that the old rule space order is changing. We do see problems with China, and we probably see them far more acutely than Terry does. Because China is a next door neighbor, and China has designs on our territory. China has designs on the rise of India's power, whether it's economic or political power. So we do have problems with China, but we've got to look at it practically because supply chains are so badly entwined. You call it a mistake made in 2001. Supply chains globally are badly entwined. And that's not going to change. That's not going to change for the better part of a decade. That can't change immediately. You can't change it overnight like this. What do you do? It's a problem that you live with. It's a problem that you acknowledge, and you work a way that's a balance out of it, which is what Trump is also doing to some extent, or the Trump administration. I wouldn't say Trump. The administration is doing to some extent because they've got this 47% average tariff on China, but at the same time, they are talking about compromises. The most significant thing that's been missed in this is that Chinese exports to the US dropped very sharply in 2025. They've been dropping over the last 6 or 7 years, while Chinese exports to a China bloc, BRI, even the ASEAN, have risen very sharply. Look at what's happened with Brazil in the last 20 months. Total US trade last year was just $80-something billion. Total trade with China, which includes both exports and imports, $171 billion. And that's been rising steadily over this last 6. At least a quarter of this trade is now denominated in the yuan. So what are you looking at? You can't fight this anymore. You can't fight this unless you have an economic system that actually accepts that there are problems. The Biden administration accepted that there were problems and they were willing to offer subsidies. They were willing to offer an industrial policy that in some ways mimicked what China was doing. Trump has withdrawn now, so he can't really copy it. But the rest of the world can. The EU can. The EU's doing that. Look at the free trade pacts that have been signed over the last 12 months. Substantially, look at the free trade agreements that India, as the world's fourth largest economy, and the EU has. Look at the pacts that have been signed with several ASEAN countries. Trade is changing. Economics are changing. The world order is changing. The question is, will the WTO survive? I'm not going to talk about the UN. I'm not an expert. Will the WTO survive in its current form, or is there going to be China domination there? Mind you, China trade domination is resented. Talk to people in Indonesia, talk to people in Vietnam, and they don't have. In Indonesia, China's exports are becoming cheaper. There's examples of several small-scale industries, medium-scale companies threatened or shutting down. They're worried about future profit. So yeah, we're in for a change. But then if you want to counter China, you need America alongside. You need some sort of collective effort. But this administration in Washington is not going to come. China has to export because its domestic economy can't absorb everything. Xi Jinping has had a conscious policy since 2023, or at least he articulated it in 2023 when he said that China has to be complete, independent, and secure. Now, when he meant complete, he meant that it's not going to give up its low-end exports either. Typically, a country goes up the GDP scale and it becomes a larger economy, and then you tend to give up some of your low-end exports, like toys. China's not giving up on any of these. The point is, trade is a means to develop a currency advantage. That's what happened to the US in the first 40 years of the 20th century. US trade was dominating. US trade was being built. China's doing exactly the same thing. So the yuan is going to come into play as a currency. It's not going to happen immediately. The numbers are still loaded in favor of the US. There's network effects in favor of the US dollar. But China's doing it. Look at what's happening with Brazil.
Vivek, I think you're absolutely spot on that the lack of domestic absorption of surplus is the main economic imbalance today. And so you said, why wouldn't the Chinese just absorb all their industrial surplus domestically? And the only reasonable conclusion that I can reach, but maybe there are others about this, is because it's destabilizing for the CCP to do that. So this is not a function of China as an industrial behemoth. This is a function of China as a CCP-dominated regime that makes them incredibly nervous about absorbing their industrial surplus through domestic consumption.
They can't get their population to increase demand.
I would agree, Claire.
Yes, but that's part of the problem. It's the structure of their economy.
Correct.
It's the way they've built their economy, and more particularly over the last 15 years. The structure of their economy is flawed, and they do need to bring about a lot of structural reforms. But at this point, you're right, it's not convenient for the CCP. If those changes happen, we're going to see a completely different form of US-China rivalry. Because at no stage will China give up its exports. For them, complete, independent, and secure is a form of what people these days call economic securitization. It's closely tied to national security. National security is no longer a matter of just defense. National security is also a matter of economic defense and economic power. The CCP is no different from anything that the EU is trying or anything that Trump is trying in his mistaken way, or anything that India is trying or Japan is trying.
We're talking about the symptoms of the problems, and I'm going to propose a framework for thinking about root causes. I have a background in engineering, Toyota production system, root cause analysis, right? So I'm going to propose 3 particular vulnerabilities that we have and a framework for understanding why those vulnerabilities are not only inevitable, but pre-political and pre-military, right? So they're upstream of politics, which makes it a pretty big problem because it means the standard political solutions are probably not going to work. So the 3 big vulnerabilities we have, and I'm going to borrow Turchin here. He has the best foundational model that we have for understanding our point in the cycle. We're at this point in a predictable civilizational cycle that runs usually for anywhere from 80 to 120 years, where successful and prosperous societies start to push economic surplus to the top, immiserate the bottom. They don't mean to, they just can't help it. As a result, you get highly intensified dissatisfaction at the base, which is MAGA, and you get intensified intra-elite conflict because the elites are increasingly comparing themselves to other elites. Okay, so now if you're China, you know that the US has 11 aircraft carrier groups and has significant military power. And then you say, but the US is entering a phase of significant intra-elite conflict. And the way it is managing that is actually by making checks it can't keep, which is the debt bubble. The long-term debt cycle is primarily a management system for rising intra-elite conflict. So Ray Dalio has it half right. He's right that there's a long-term debt cycle that's going to burst. Turchin's theory is superordinate over Dalio's. He says there's a reason why this always happens. Okay, so if you're China, you want to capitalize on intra-elite conflict and popular immiseration. You've got a divided elite that cannot resist your attacks. You know that you militarily can't defeat the US military, but what you can do is you can exacerbate intra-elite conflict until the debt bubble bursts, and then the US will no longer be able to pay for its military, and then you can stroll into Taiwan for pennies on the dollar. This is the plan. And the 1930s in the United States, we did a great job of de-escalating intra-elite conflict. This is one of the unseen factors that led to US hegemony after World War II. We managed our own intra-elite conflict. Now, one last thought. China is the same point in the structural demographic cycle as us. The PLA is a wholly owned subsidiary of the CCP. It doesn't belong to the country. It belongs to the Communist Party. Xi is the only civilian leader on their Supreme War Council. He has eliminated all other generals from that council. The only general left with him on that council right now is the anti-corruption guy, who is basically his headsman. So they are trying to exacerbate our intra-elite conflict to force a financial crisis for us, whilst knowing that they are at extremely high risk of having both of those problems themselves right now.
That's good, solid. Good, solid.
Steve, what are the 3 vulnerabilities very concisely?
One is the structural wealth pump. So what is locally adaptive for wealthy people is to grow their assets. But as Thomas Piketty has pointed out, if R is greater than G, returns are greater than overall growth for long enough, then there's only one way that story's going to end. By the way, the AI productivity boom is an attempt by our system to prove him wrong in a healthy way, right? So what we're hoping is that we generate so much productivity that we can keep pumping wealth to the elites without immiserating the general public. I'm not super optimistic we're going to get that right, but Mark Andreessen is arguing for that. That is why we've poured a civilization's worth of wealth into AI's supremacy. So that's number one, the wealth pump. Number 2 is absolute popular immiseration, not just relative popular immiseration, but absolute. You should all read on Substack Turchin's Structural Demographic State of America. He has pointed out that the average height of American children is declining and has been for 10, 15 years. This has been observed throughout history. It's a very reliable and robust marker. So if you want to compare now to 1400, there aren't that many metrics used across history, but this is one of them. So that's number two. Number three is downstream of this, because the debt system is trying to kick the can down the road on elite overproduction, interest rivalry, and popular immiseration. You use debt as a mechanism for concealing all the inconsistencies. So you're immiserating everyone, but the government borrows money to make sure that life doesn't become hellish for people. And so your transfer payments go up. But eventually your debt bubble explodes. And what Dalio says is that eventually you lose reserve currency status. That's what happens every 120 years. So Dalio thinks we're about to lose it. I don't think the Chinese are going to get it, because they're in worse shape than us on this front. Talk about intra-elite conflict. We argue with each other, and Tim Walz shouts at Donald Trump and Trump shouts back. Of the top 50 Chinese generals in the last few years, at least 20 of them have been fired, and at least 20 others have disappeared without trace. No one knows where they are.
Only 2 people on that 7-person super committee now, right?
Yeah, it's Xi and his chip man.
Right.
He's the head of anti-corruption in the military.
Hey, don't forget, too, though, that if you're China, you have a U.S. president who's openly mused about whether it would be good to intentionally default on our debt.
We're going to monetize it. There's no question. We're going to monetize it. And we're going to try and not lose reserve status when we do. It's what always happens. Bitcoin is a total fiction.
It can be seen as the market searching for a reserve currency.
Correct. It's an adaptive behavior that is peak Baudrillard, tier 4 simulation, magical thinking. It's the right search and it's the wrong answer.
I personally think this reserve currency thing is slightly overdone. The critical thing to watch for is trade and changes in trade currency, which are coming about. This is the latest IMF and Bank of International Settlements data. The dollar is still involved in about 88% of global foreign exchange trade. Roughly half of international payments, something like 52% of international payments. If you look at reserves, it's about 56% of reserves. It's down a little, 2% over the last 4 years. But that's largely because people have shifted to gold and they've shifted to other currencies. The Chinese yuan has been 2% or thereabouts for a very long time. It's grown, of course, over 10 years to 2%, but it's still. So what we need to look at is what's happening in trade. Incidentally, people keep quoting the figure that it's come down from the US as the dollar as a reserve currency has come down from something like 70% 20 years ago. But if we go back in time in the mid-90s, it was actually 46%. So there's kind of a global cycle. But as Simon pointed out, the danger is the US deficit. It's risen from 10 trillion in 2008, around the time of the financial crisis, to 34 trillion today. And that's dangerous. Trade deficit that Trump keeps talking about is less critical. Can the US go back to a system where it becomes a globally competitive manufacturer? Yes, using AI across a whole lot of systems, it can. But as Simon will know, as an engineer, you calculate product costs. And there are various elements that come into product costs. The US has high power costs. It has some of the highest energy costs in the world. You can't compete like that. You've got to look at every element and look at bringing that down, which is in some ways what Biden's Build Back Better was trying to do. But now it's going away. If they go to nuclear, yes, the prices are going to come down. But it's going to take a while to build nuclear overnight. Got the
That's true.
technology, Westinghouse. The data centers would do with Westinghouse 60 megawatts small reactors. But there isn't enough of a push to subsidize them. So he talks about nuclear, but where's the plan?
I wanted to ask you, Terry, if the Canadian Conservative Party, as it currently is constituted, are alarmed and sufficiently mobilized against what's going on with China and the intelligence penetration that is happening. Second question is that it seemed a generation ago, national newspapers did have the capacity to identify scandals, and this should be a national scandal, then to mobilize public opinion. The journalism that you're producing should be scandalous.
If I can broaden that question, I'm curious whether it's possible to raise the salience of an issue like this among a mass public in this fragmented media age?
That was totally my question.
This is a really good question. And this is actually a preoccupation to the point of an obsession of mine. It's the reason why I launched my newsletter, to which everyone should subscribe. Now, I actually had to give a talk a couple of months ago in Ottawa on the question of foreign interference in the media. And I'm trying to encourage people to get their heads around the idea traditional media is falling apart and it's being destroyed to some extent. And it's withering on the vine. The recent layoffs at the Washington Post are a good example. In Canada, you've got 42 journalists across the country who have in their beats foreign policy, foreign trade, foreign interference, China off the side of their desks for the most part. 26 of those work for the CBC. The CBC has not broken a single story of any consequence about Chinese interference in Canada at all. Okay? And I love the CBC. If it were up to me, I'd be spending more money on the CBC. I'm not one of these people who says the CBC is just a mouthpiece for the globalist elites who run the country. You've got a couple of others that are really focused on this. But yes, if it were not for journalism, we would not have seen any response of any consequence. For instance, to the kidnapping of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. This occurred as a consequence of Canada detaining Hong Zhou, who is chief financial officer for Huawei, China's national champion in telecommunications. A lot of people thought, oh, this poor Chinese executive was pinched by the RCMP on her way to some foreign destinations during a stopover in Vancouver. She's a Vancouverite. She's a central pillar of the Mandarin bloc in Canada. She's got 2 mansions in Vancouver, and her kids were going to school here. Canadians are disgusted by this. If it were not for Canadian revulsion, we would not have seen the Hogue inquiry into foreign interference. If it were not for Canadian revulsion, we would not have seen the kind of public attention that's interrupted the Liberal government's determination to integrate Canada's economy with Chinese markets and Chinese capital. The Conservative Party of Canada, very strange beast. During the 21 federal elections, Aaron O'Toole was the leader of the Conservative Party. He was targeted by the United Front and the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office in an interference campaign that mobilized legacy Chinese language media in Canada, which is completely controlled now, completely controlled by the United Front Work Department. And more importantly, Chad Weibo and so on, the things that we quaintly still describe as social media. Elon Musk is the mainstream media in the United States now. So the Conservative Party now is led by a guy named Pierre Poilievre. This is an interesting little sidebar, by the way. I think a lot of people have a hard time getting their heads around this. Why, for instance, is Donald Trump, why is he so nice to Mark Carney? Why did he want Mark Carney to win the election? Why has he never said a bad word about Mark Carney? Why did he claim credit for Mark Carney's election after Chrystia Freeland properly defenestrated Justin Trudeau and said, I'm done with this guy, I'm out of here. The Liberals elect a new guy, Mark Carney, and Trump likes him. And the reason is that Pierre Poilievre, who's the new leader of the Conservative Party, he's a nerdish guy. A lot of people, I think, unfairly attribute Trumpist characteristics to him, although there's certainly a chunk of his base. The problem with Pierre Poilievre from a Trumpist perspective is the man is a populist and a patriot, and he does not like Donald Trump. And he actually had a lot of support, interestingly, in the Trumpist universe among people who are not completely brain damaged. Ben Shapiro and others. And when Trump started all of those vulgar utterances about Canada being acquired by economic force and pressure as America's 51st state, Poilievre was very plain that the president should shut his cake hole. He was very serious about it. And Trump was astonished and Trump was upset. So I regret to say, Matteo, there is within the Conservative Party a very solid core in the caucus of decent people. That's as far as I will go in a partisan sense, who care about human rights, care very deeply about healthy and decent relationship between Canada and the United States, care about foreign policy. Michael Chong, who was targeted by the United Front in an election interference campaign, we actually had to declare a Chinese diplomat working out of the Toronto consulate persona non grata and kick him out of the country because he was leading an effort to identify Michael's relatives in Hong Kong so that they could be persecuted and pressured. Michael Cooper. There's a handful of conservative benchers and front benchers who would fit perfectly into the conversation we're having, speak exactly the same kind of language. But I believe has been more or less a conscious decision in Poilievre's office or among his strategists that it's better to keep stum. There's no percentage in making an issue unless the media raises it, unless it comes up in some way. The recent request by a bureau within the Central Committee for a parliamentary exchange just last week with a Canadian Foreign Affairs Committee, when you've got Canadian members of Parliament that are actually sanctioned in China and senior members of that particular parliamentary committee who would be arrested if they go to China. And it comes up. They make an issue of it, but the Conservatives are not interested in making an issue of this to the point that they would be requiring 14 or 15 candidates in an upcoming election to die on this hill. 14 or 15 ridings in this country that you would not get elected dog catcher if the United Front Work Department would prefer that you not. It's tough. The reach is very deep. Vivek made a point, by the way, about penetration of Chinese trade. It basically came too late. Whatever Trump was doing, all of these fancy 50%, 100% tariffs. I think Vivek will correct me if I'm wrong. Only about 15%, I think, of Chinese exports are America bound. So it's a command and control economy, right? America could just erect a wall on Chinese exports and it would not really affect the Chinese economy. It's a command and control economy. They could sort it out. In Canada's case, 25% roughly of our GDP is based on trade. Something like 75% of our trade goes to the United States. So we're extremely vulnerable, although maybe not as vulnerable as people think. We're over-reliant on trade. We're over-reliant on trade with the United States. China is to Australia as the United States is to Canada. Australia is overwhelmingly dependent upon China in its trade relationships, and yet Australia has demonstrated some mettle. It's been tough, but they actually do have a foreign interference law that appears to be vaguely effective. Australians, they're very much like Canadians in many ways, and the British to some extent. They have a very clear sense of fair play and decency, and they don't like it. They don't like it when these big bullies come in and start pushing people around. So the Australians were actually a model for our own foreign interference law. It was first tabled 5 years ago in the House of Commons in Canada. The man who tabled it, Kenny Chiu, he wasn't reelected because of a concerted campaign by the Chinese consulate to get rid of him. So 5 years later, and after all of these scandals, our own foreign interference law is just emerging from the consultation stage. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that rather than prohibited foreign interference or act to protect against it, we're normalizing it. We're regulating it. You can get a parking ticket for violating the foreign interference law. $100 fine, I think, was the base. The Australians, however, do provide a very useful model, and they've done their best. And I think, to be fair to Carney, look, he won the election at a time when the Liberal Party was, I think, 14, 15% in the polls.
Completely.
There was absolutely no way after a decade of Justin Trudeau and the damage that guy did to this country.
And that was Trump that delivered the election for him.
Carney comes along, takes over the Liberal Party, gets elected. And he did it by speaking to Canadians and their sense of who they were. There was an upwelling of national pride that had been suppressed for at least a decade. It was amazing. Give him credit.
Not only did he unify the country and manage to get himself elected, I thought that in his speech, he made some important points. I think he was bidding to be the leader of a bloc of middle power. And I think that is a strategy that Canada should pursue.
What do you mean by middle power? You mean Qatar? You mean
Qatar's a
Qatar?
difficult one, but Certainly all the countries of Central and South America, Southeast Asia, Europe, obviously,
This
Israel.
isn't a new idea. Do you remember Janet Yellen? Do you remember friendshoring? Good idea. That's not what Mark Carney's talking about, Claire.
Why do you say it's not what he's talking about?
Terry, I share that impression because I read his speech and I heard a video. That was my first thought. I put that on the basis of a whole lot of economic changes and trade changes that are coming, even between the US and Canada. I'd love to hear you on this.
The funny thing is, I love Claire, okay? I confess my love to Claire Berlinski. And I agree with her analysis by and large. But I insist that the cause that our grandparents and parents fought and died for, that the one flag, the one banner from that period that is still flying, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that should be the basis of our relationships with one another, that we should come to one another's aid. Why does everybody focus on Mark bloody Carney? Did you not read or listen to Vladimir Zelensky's speech in Davos? This is my concern, okay? I confess my bias is that a community of democracies is what I would like to see emerge from this period of absolute bedlam. Is it possible? Who knows? That's not what Carney's talking about. That's not what Mark Carney is interested in. He could not give a damn, okay? Look, it's already happened. The damage has already been done. What did our foreign affairs minister say when she was at the Munich Security Conference yesterday? Didn't mention China once. Last week, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service said, yeah, Russia, meh. The main problem that Canada has in terms of sovereignty in the Arctic is China, okay? When Carney went to Beijing, he ordered 2 Liberal MPs who were visiting Taiwan to leave Taiwan. It's happened. The senior deputy minister within the propaganda bureau of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party is the co-chair of a new cultural framework, the Canadian co-chair of whom is the Canadian Minister of Identity and Culture. The RCMP has just entered into a solemn covenant with the Public Security Bureau in China. We have 11 Hong Kong and diaspora organizations in Canada saying they are terrified of the implications here. We have rolled the clock back to those hours and days and minutes when Justin Trudeau and the McKinsey associates developed the whole program, our foreign policy, the immigration policy, the whole damn thing, embedded within the finance minister, right back to 2015, when Trudeau said the whole point of this is to enter into a free trade agreement with China and to enter into an extradition treaty with the People's Republic of China. It is that bad.
First question, does it do anything to foster democracy or human rights to decline to trade with another power? That's question number 1. 2, we're talking about 2 issues. We're talking about China as a predator and the demise of the liberal world order. Let's connect those. If we wanted to create a system that provided a disincentive to China for predation, do we have anything like the institutions that would help us to do this? What kind of institutions would we need? And the institutions that we have that might be useful in this regard, are they defunct?
Certainly the United Nations Human Rights Council has been corrupted. It wasn't that long ago when I could travel throughout China. I could go and visit the place where all the Chinese Canadians came from, 5 counties at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta, Guangzhou, Guangdong. You go to Hong Kong. Everybody I ever interviewed or spoke with or had lunch with in Hong Kong is now in prison, in jail, on trial, or in exile. What did we do? What price was extracted? Canada hasn't sanctioned anybody as a consequence.
I tackle his question. Human rights and aid are mutually exclusive. That's a reality.
No.
It should be, but that's an ideal world. In the real
How is
world,
that ideal?
the ideal would be human rights, but we didn't see that during the Cold War because they were 2 different economic systems that didn't compete with each other at all. And here we see this because since 1989, 1990, China's economic system is a mirror image of the West. The reasons why the US was willing to get China into the WTO, the reasons why American firms actually went there have to do with deep economics. They have to do with production costs. They have to do with cost sectors. They have to do with American economics itself. So it's inevitable that was going to happen. But the US was naive in 2001 when it assumed that if China would come into the system, it would evolve in a way that made it more similar to Western ideals than otherwise. That hasn't happened. That was never going to happen because China is different. It's civilization. It's a far more complex picture. And on trade, you look at the trade issue today and you look at Canada's trade position and the way it has deteriorated after years and decades of Trudeau. And with the whole USMCA negotiation coming up later this year, Carney's got to have some cards to play. So he's playing some cards. I look at it from a rational, realistic perspective. So my perspective is completely different from Terry's. Sorry, Terry.
It's strange how you're both possessed by wishful thinking, but being a complete defeatist at the same time. Well done.
Wishful thinking about what?
Just that this is the way of the world and it's the way it's going to be, and there's nothing wrong with it. And it's ideal that we decouple human rights from trade.
Why is that wishful thinking?
Maybe I'll leave it to Vivek to explain it. Part of it is that India can afford to be defeatist on these issues. Mother India, for God's sake, you're the largest democracy on the face of the earth.
Actually, we're not defeatist on this issue. And what we've been talking about all along and what we're sharply emphasizing today, even with the trade deal, and I put deal in double quotes, and we're probably going to sign with Trump. We're talking about strategic autonomy. So that's a completely different thing. To say that we've been defeaters is a mistake. It's just about being realist.
Does it do any good to not trade with a country if you're trying to change its behavior?
I think you're wrong about that. Your assumption is that the whole point of the kind of sanctions that I've been sympathetic to is to change China's behavior. I don't anticipate that's necessarily possible. I would argue that when you look at the trajectory of China's magnificent, just spectacular economic, technological development over the past 25 years, it was fashionable to say that you got to hand it to them. They lifted 350 million people out of poverty. It's bullshit, complete bullshit. The Chinese people did that themselves, largely because the Chinese Communist Party was forced to lift its boot from their necks because they had been exhausted by the Cultural Revolution, by the whole Gang of Four business. And also, China managed to do this because they were allowed to exploit the vulnerabilities of the democracies, the economies in the democratic world, because of the provisions in the World Trade Organization and because of the corruption in the corporate class in the United States and Europe. I would be satisfied if we could figure out a way to prevent their further erosion of European and Canadian sovereignty. I worry less about the United States in that respect. I would be satisfied with that. I would be satisfied if Canada could actually be a bit of a refuge for dissidents in Hong Kong and what have you. I don't have as high expectations as you seem to think I have.
So, quick observation. Your comment about the boot being lifted off the neck, that's accurate. If you look at that economic miracle, they loosened things up and they allowed the natural energy of the Chinese people to emerge. But then they played all these games. Li Keqiang was a huge architect of that, certainly during the 90s, and then mysteriously dropped dead of a heart attack in his 50s. Draw your own conclusions. It's very clear that Xi Jinping thought, having banked all these gains of the loosening of the boot from the neck, and they did bank those gains, they've got the systems in place. In the last 10 years, certainly maybe longer, the boot has been gradually reapplied.
Yeah.
We have to get our own house in order to be able to resist, right? Claire, your question was, is it rational or irrational to trade with a state that might be hostile or have a different attitude towards human rights? The answer is it depends. If you thought you were going to have to go to war with this state at some point, you would cease all trade immediately because your defense industrial complex might be dependent on their supply chain. Can you guarantee that we will never have to go to war with them? And if you can't, then you have your answer.
I understand exactly the argument you're making. You're saying we are allowing them to have their foot on our jugular by having such complex supply chains and allowing them to be the sole provider of things, for example, like ventilators. I think that's a very good argument for getting critical supply chains friendshored or away from China. But does the kind of deal that Carney proudly signed necessarily mean Chinese influence in Canada, or is that a different problem that can be solved through different means? And does it necessarily mean a moral compromise that shouldn't be made, given their human rights rights?
Okay, everybody's focused on cars and canola, okay? Everybody's focused on the EV Chinese deal, which is dodgy in my view, very dodgy, but even the American automakers are willing to look at partnerships with Chinese EV makers. And canola, how embarrassing that we've allowed ourselves to be so vulnerable to Chinese strong arming that a big chunk of Canada's agricultural production can be turned on and off at Beijing's whim. But that's just this immediate foreground. It's the larger background issues, I think. It's the long-term strategic partnership, Claire, between Canada and China that Carney is perfectly consistent with everything that he did, everything that he's ever done in his life, and everything that powerful wing of the Liberal Party has ever wanted. The thing that annoys me, it's people thinking that we're being driven unwillingly into the arms of China by the beastly Donald Trump. Give it a rest. Do you really think we would have done any different? We did this, we cemented this, we made the commitment a year and a half before Donald Trump was elected. Okay?
Yeah.
Before Carney had even taken over as the head of the Liberal Party, a year and a half before Donald Trump was elected. Okay. There is no way that Carney and the Liberals would have done any different had Kamala Harris been elected instead of Donald Trump. So that's the thing that I get annoyed by. Get that into your heads, right?
You persuaded me. Your argument is good.
Yeah. Okay, fine. People say you can't ignore China. Okay, let's not. I would like to see us selling a little natural gas to China. I think that'd be cool. I think we're kidding ourselves if we imagine that there's going to be any entry, any advantage that Canada is going to enjoy in access to China's domestic consumer markets. That's just mental. That's mental thinking. And I also want to actually almost give Donald Trump some credit here. In his noticing, I think it was the first time he mentioned the business about hockey. And he said something like, if Canada becomes a port of entry for Chinese goods or something, then we're going to blow Canada up and we're going to invade Ontario, whatever he said. Just crazy shit. He actually has a point there. During the Chrétien era, we spent something like $22 billion in tax money in the, oh God, had all these fancy names, improving Pacific port infrastructure. And the whole argument was that we were going to use this as an opportunity to trade with Asia. The Chinese stuff was always downplayed. We would have this wonderful opportunity to exploit trade opportunities that we never really had before. All kinds of road and rail and port infrastructure. And that infrastructure, because we were 58 hours closer to Shanghai than LA, was a means by which China could move all of that excess production into all of those big box stores in the dead industrial heartland of America. Yeah, I can see why Americans get a little bit pissed off.
What's the end game on that, Terry? Do you see an end game? Do they keep shipping surplus to us forever? Or is there a development of that strategy? Imagine that you're Xi Jinping right now. Do you just keep doing that? Or are there other things that you want to do with that now that you've done that?
Obviously, this is the other thing. I used to beat up on people a lot for saying, China's going to liberalize, it's going to become more like us. And you idiot. Anybody who knows about China knows that's not going to happen. But nobody saw just how deep and dark and wild this was going to get with the emergence of Xi Jinping and everything that he's done, accumulating more power to himself than Mao Zedong. People still haven't got their heads around this. It's really amazing what he's done. He's China's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, except that he has his hands on all these levers and disappears anybody who disagrees with him. And also the extent to which they've employed digital technologies and artificial intelligence to control down to the most minute level what Chinese people are allowed to do and think. He's been very clear what his end game is. And it's what he's described as the community of the common destiny of humankind. He owns Africa now, for God's sake.
Yeah.
The Chinese, the way they've moved into Central and South America is gobsmacking. Stuff that would usually take a year, 5 years, 10 years, 2, 3 weeks, done. That's his end game. And as far as the United States is concerned, as an export market, man, he could lose it. It wouldn't hurt.
I am magically giving you the power to determine the foreign policy of the United States, Latin America, Europe, all of America's traditional allies, and Canada. What policy do you want them to adopt with respect to China? If this is absolutely ideal in your mind.
I would include Taiwan and Japan in that for sure.
Yeah, I said traditional allies.
I don't know. You don't want me with my hands anywhere near the levers of power, trust me. In a very general way, we should be cognizant of and aware of the moment in which we live. We should no longer allow our political classes to enrich themselves by their alliances and connivances with Vladimir Putin and with Xi Jinping and with the Ayatollahs in Iran and so on. We should be more conscious of ourselves as liberal democracies, as brothers and sisters in that community, and we should treat our enemies accordingly. That's all.
The accordingly I want to know about.
We should isolate them as much as possible. Obviously, we shouldn't allow police states to terrorize and harass and persecute diaspora communities within our borders. That'd be a nice start. But I don't think we should allow their access to our economic systems to enrich themselves, to further engorge themselves, and to more readily oppress and persecute their own people.
So how about if we created something like a WTO 2.0? Something like the TPP, for example, or what about if we ratified the TPP and said we are going to trade with each other on a priority basis? For China, there's tariffs and no special trade deals.
Interesting you should mention the TPP. To get Canada into the TPP, they had to change its name. But of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was established as a bulwark against Beijing's hegemony. And what was the first thing that the Trudeau government proposed? We should invite China to join the TPP. How are they financing the Belt and Road? The Development Bank. We invested $1 billion in that. There's a lot of work that we would need to do, Claire, domestically and politically. And the Americans certainly have a hell of a lot of work to do.
The TPP
Was a missed opportunity par excellence. That's one of the things we should think about returning to if we want to try and fix this situation.
The moral compromises that a democracy has to make to trade with a country like China. 2 examples. The West decides it really needs lithium-ion batteries. We need tons of them. But we care about our environment, so we aren't going to build the mines on our territory or the manufacturing or refining that dumps incredible amounts of toxic sludge everywhere. So we have outsourced that to China. And the other example is that we really like cheap stuff. And one of the ways you get cheap stuff is by using involuntary labor. It's an unspoken moral compromise. We have outsourced our involuntary labor to China.
Yeah.
Once you get your nose under the tent, there's a moral corruption. It's hard to justify and how to get back from it.
Here would be the justification I would offer. I would say, yes, it is corrupting, and yes, we should be aware of it. But not trading with China, we can't pretend that that's a morally neutral decision. Trade enriches people. Trade creates prosperity. When you talk about the number of people who've been lifted out of poverty in the past 40 odd years, you're talking about a reduction in the sum total of human misery that is astonishing. And anyone our age, Terry, who's traveled around the world has seen this, has seen the difference between the kind of poverty that we saw when we were teenagers in very poor countries and now. Only very wealthy people have the luxury of thinking that there is no moral valence to getting people out of poverty. I would say that poverty is the world's biggest human rights crisis. So these have to be weighed against one another.
But Claire, we have a problem with the CCP. We're already in a war. It's a moral war, using John Boyd's analogy. He talks about 3 kinds of warfare: kinetic, moral, and information. It is not an information war. Information is just the vector. It is a moral war. The only way to solve the problem the way that you would like to solve it, which I think is the most moral way to solve it, is to figure out how to end the rule of the CCP. Can that be done without creating more of a mess in the first place? I don't know. I advocated to friends 20 years ago the elimination of the CCP, and they thought I was out of my mind. If you think something really bad is going to happen in 20 years, what's the moral thing? Is it to just wait and see, or act decisively 20 years too early? And 20 years before most people can see that the problem's going to get really bad. I think it's a good thing that neither Terry nor I are close to the levers of policy, because I would be much more aggressive about containing the CCP. In that sense, I'm a bit of a Trumpist.
Except he's done exactly the opposite.
You really destabilize the CCP and destabilize the entire global economy.
No,
8 billion people across the world. At least 6
No.
billion of those really suffer.
it depends how you do it.
Look at Africa, look at Southeast Asia. They would be suffering. A large part of the economy is dependent on
Well,
China.
hold on a second. I'm not suggesting destroying their economy. I mean, the CCP is not the same as China.
You destabilize the economy, Claire, and that country is going to go through an implosion or some kind of a crisis for quite a long time. And in that process, you're going to impact the global economy. You're going to slow the global economy. You're going to hurt economies which are dependent on China.
If the CCP went away, the Chinese economy would change in unpredictable ways. But those people still want to eat. They still want to sell stuff. They're not going to turn into zombies. They're going to keep functioning. It'll sort itself out in some manner. Now, it may get ugly. You may go back to the days of the Chinese warlords, but it isn't necessarily going to work out badly.
For 4 or 5 years, you're going to have chaos.
My base case is not stability, though.
I'm with Simon on this. I'm really astonished. I have found a solid, loyal comrade in Simon Pierce. This is really good. I'm with him on this. You're quite right, Claire. I'm a geezer now, right? Like, I'm 70. I can remember what India was like, Vivek, in the 1980s. Okay.
Right.
Spent a lot of time in India, spent a lot of time in Delhi, in Punjab, and more recently up in the Northeast, in the Patkai Ranges, the Himalayas, Nagaland. And I'm telling you, the change, the radical transformation of India is just, you just fall down on your knees.
Exactly.
It's amazing. It's Limerick in Ireland, going from a black and white movie to a color movie within 5 years of Ireland joining the EU. I get it. For me to see the landscape of my own childhood, the Cantonese farms on the lower Fraser River, I had to travel to the Pearl River, to the most rural areas of the Pearl River Delta to see that landscape, okay? Same people, same farming technology, same traditions. You're right, Claire. There has been a magnificent transformation in the human experience that is largely, significantly a consequence of global trade, no question. But then you look at the early 19th century, in kind of a period of peace when you think about it. Slavery did an amazing job in elevating the standard of living of a lot of Englishmen. And I'm sorry, but there does come a point where if we are a democracy, most people have some sort of sense of morality. You can't divorce foreign policy from the values of the people, all right? In Canada, it's almost been easy to do that in some respects because we actually didn't have full control over our foreign policy until the Treaty of Westminster of 1931. So it was always leave it to the experts. And a lot of democracies, I think, do that in their own unique ways. But I do think that this needs to be a conversation that does mobilize the ideas and the values of ordinary people in democracies. And I don't think we can just sit back and say, well, that's just the way it is, and China's going to do what China's going to do, and
I did not say
trading
that.
patterns.
That's not what I said.
Pardon me?
That's not what I said.
Oh, no, I know you didn't say that. I know you didn't say that.
That's not what I'm saying either.
Pretty damn close, Vivek.
I disagree. I just leave it at that.
Okay.
I want to go around clockwise and get a sense from everyone of what aspects of the international liberal order they think are fixable, which are dead, and what we need to confront this and other 21st century challenges. Just quickly, just want to get a sense of where everyone is. Start with you, Terry.
I'd be interested to know what other people think about this very issue. I think I've made my case fairly plain. My greatest concern is that the vast majority of people have no goddamn idea what's going on around them.
Right.
and just how deep and dark this is.
Okay. Timothy, what's your answer to those three questions?
Overwhelming U.S. dominance is probably dead. A lot of the norms, like territorial integrity of states, can be preserved, especially if Ukraine wins against Russia. That's a norm that other countries have tried violating. Argentina, Saddam Hussein, they had to be pushed back, but were pushed back. I think we need a better educated populace that's actually aware of these issues.
Yeah. In terms of building institutions.
Something like the TPP that includes all liberal democracies. The WTO is going to become the United Nations, right? It's not going to be super relevant.
Okay, Vivek, how do you answer that question?
Okay, just one aside. Terry, I'm 63 years old, so I remember that India that you're talking about. I grew up in. But okay, coming back to your question, Claire, I think US dominance was really on the decline. For a while, we got to go through a period of relative turbulence because rival powers, probably a group of powers competing for influence globally. We got to see that for a while. We have to live with it. Is the WTO dead? Possibly not. I'm hoping it's not. Has Trump killed the WTO, or has he tried to change the WTO completely? Yes, he has. Is the WTO system therefore subject to change in the future? Yes. I'm hoping it's going to be for the better. So there will be a WTO around. It will change for the better, is my hope. On the question of democracies, I'm afraid we're going to have to live with this question of China, with their illiberalism for a while. Like Simon said, there are signs of discontent there. Is that actually going to change signs? Probably not, because the Chinese mind is quite different from the Western. They adopted and adapted some of the Western canons, the Western ethos, but that's not fundamental to the Chinese. So we've got to start with the civilization perspective, which is where we miss when we look at a whole lot of civilizational states from a Western perspective.
When I hear this, I often think, why is Taiwan a liberal democracy?
Taiwan and South Korea have evolved into that. They have adapted. But Taiwan doesn't have the same civilization ethos mainland China has. Let's appreciate them. It was always an outlier, even when it was controlled by the Chinese emperors. So it was different completely. We have to understand that bit of history. And yes, I think the UN system has failed. We need to change the UN system completely.
The Security Council is useless.
Yeah, it's way beyond the Security Council. The Security Council is just a symptom.
The World Health Organization has been corrupted by China. And
Exactly.
any international body that includes China is going to be corrupted by it.
Which is why we need a new system. What sort of a future move is that going to be? Not unless the EU, North and South America, Australia, and perhaps even India come together.
Simon, what's your answer to that question?
What's dead is the compact between Western people and the Western elites. I think our institutions demand obsequience from the people and yet provide them with nothing. What can be saved is almost everything. We have a human resources problem. We don't have an institutional design problem. The best institutions in the world are worthless if you hire the wrong people to run them. The shell of the structure, most of it could be saved, but we need not just a new set of elites to displace the exhausted ones, but a strong reset of incentives, and we need to restore administrative competence. When I was joking about being a Trumpist, he's almost like Karl Marx. He perfectly diagnoses the problem and then proceeds to completely make a botch of a solution. So actually, if we can figure out a relatively peaceful way to have incentive reset and elite turnover within institutions, almost all of it could be saved. What we should do is restore, God knows how we do it in the US. Wouldn't even dare to know how to begin because it's such a mess here. What we've got to do is restore our sovereignty by reestablishing the compact between the people and the elites, and then follow Ray Dalio's beautiful deleveraging program, which he has proposed to the Senate. He met with the Senate Finance Committee in private 4 months ago And by the way, he doesn't normally talk publicly about these meetings, but he was so disappointed, he talked afterwards and said, I proposed my beautiful deleveraging plan. It would get us back on a sustainable path. It would solve the long-term debt crisis. And they said, we love your plan, Ray, and we're not going to do it. So I refer you to part 2 of my answer, HR turnover, because their reasons for telling Ray that they would not do it are they value their own careers over the survival of their civilization. And this has to be the motivation for the HR turnover. We have to understand that the survival of our civilization is at stake. And without a complete HR turnover in these key institutions is not going to happen.
Your answer is the world order is actually fine. It's just the people running it who are the problem.
I don't want to personalize that. I would say the incentives that select for those people are broken. And we need to figure out how to shift the incentives. And that is not easy to do. So I'm not just saying nasty people wake up in the morning and take power. That is somewhat cartoonish.
I understand.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Matteo?
I agree that the majority of the structure can be restored. It's only this year that it started to fall apart. It was creaking on until now. The American administration made the whole thing fall apart, but it doesn't have to be that way necessarily. The problem is the information ecosystem. That's what's broken. Our primitive minds cannot handle the internet or social media or AI. The tech center needs to be regulated until oblivion. Let all the satellites fall out of the sky and shut down the data centers and return to an analog era. I think that would be great.
A while ago, I wrote a piece about how we should bomb the undersea cables.
Why not? I think that might do more than most things. When it comes to China, I'm on the path dependency route. I think that if Mao would have died during the Long March and if the communists wouldn't have made it to safety, we'd be seeing a very different world today, possibly. But no political system is fixed. I think China understands that. The CCP is playing for keeps. And we should get that too. And I think Terry's research and journalism has helped us understand that better today.
Okay, Robert.
The only thing that's really dead or close to dead is U.S. dominance. Some things are in a death spiral. U.S. dominance of the world economic order, it's going to slowly go away, even if we revive ourselves institutionally, just because of size physics. Savable, but on life support. Alliances like NATO. Get back to me in November or in 2028. The future, a reckoning with world oligarchs is absolutely a civilizational, existential issue for the next 20, 30 years. Everything's on the table because of that.
And what do we need?
Ideally to kill them all, but it is a complex, and I don't mean complex in a throwaway sense, truly complex, like David Snowden complexity theory, things we haven't thought of before. I don't even know.
I don't know if any of you ever read my book about Margaret Thatcher, but if you did, do you remember that wiring diagram? Is there anyone here who read it? I don't want to know the answer to that.
I've read it, but I don't remember the diagram.
This was her advisor, Sir John Hoskins, presented her with an incredibly complex diagram to show her what was wrong with the UK. We need a wiring diagram like that to diagnose what's wrong with the international system and with liberal democracies right now, because everything is feeding into everything else, the education system, into the rise of the internet, into the rise of oligarchy. And so these are complex problems, no doubt. Did I miss anyone? Did I hear from you, Jamie?
This has been great. So much so clear that I'm going to be super late for the family thing. I want to go back to the international trading order. International institutions like the WTO are always a bit frustrating. It's done on adjudication. Is it dead? It's partially dead because no one has been appointed to the appellate body forever, and they've been blocking appointments. So functionally, yes, it's dead. You can't really bring the plates there. And the interesting thing about the TPP was it had investment protections. That was a really important part of certain trade agreements, which many people hate. And that's why people were so against it, because these corporations were able to sue governments for certain rules that even domestically a corporation, especially in Canada, wouldn't be able to challenge. The international organizations that we had really were a break on sovereignty. When you had to make a decision, you had to make sure it was consistent with Chapter 11 of NAFTA. You were like, we're going to prohibit X. No, actually, you can't. Biden came back. Okay, we're back. We're back. In Ukraine, we're back in NATO, and we are going to be good stewards again on these rules. We're going to actually comply with them this time. Would that make a difference now? Because the world's trust has been now broken twice. He was elected again.
Ken.
Yeah, I have a different way of looking at all of this, because nations and leaders and people with a lot of economic power tend to act in what they believe to be their own best interests. We look back and we detect patterns and we say, oh, there was an order that was driving their decisions, when in fact, it's just a pattern. I think if we recognize that, then you stop saying, oh, we need to build a structure to guide everybody, because people aren't going to be guided by the structure. The structure evolves from nations and people trying to find a way to protect their own interests. If you look at it from that perspective, there is a chance to find common interest and common ground and work some things out. But trying to preserve old institutions because we think they used to actually control things might be a distraction.
If you were king or world emperor as of today, and you decided that we need a structure of democracies that trades exclusively or largely within that, you'd have to build something like the TPP.
Yeah, somebody, God, would have to make, or emperor would have to make a decision. That country is immoral and out of bounds, and we're not going to trade with them. And this one over here is okay. They're doing good. And then just have the good countries trade with each other and exclude the other countries.
Precisely.
But then you got to have some human making that decision. One of the great problems with humans organizing themselves is the underlying truth that men are jerks. That's always the problem when you have a small group making big decisions, and the human element causes problems.
You don't need an ideal world to have effective international organizations. The International Postal Union, for example, works even though men are jerks. All right, Jim.
Yeah. What do the members of the panel think of the possibility that there could be a set of organizations replacing the World Trade, maybe the TPP, even the United Nations? How likely do you think that would be, and what effects would that have of the problems that we've addressed today?
Can we just narrow it down a little bit? Is that a possibility given this administration or another administration?
No, just in general over the next 10 years.
I think if there's a will and political demand for it, it's perfectly possible. I think we have to specify the conditions to give probabilities.
Yeah, I'm just speaking in the abstract. It wouldn't even necessarily have to be spearheaded by the United States.
No, it wouldn't. That's why I was encouraged when I thought, now that you've dissuaded me, and now I know that Mark Carney's only interested in getting close with Beijing and has no interest at all in being the leader of a middle group of democratic trading nations. But I liked that idea when that's what I thought of.
Such an organization wouldn't necessarily completely marginalize China or even Russia after the war is over, but it would certainly facilitate trade amongst liberal democracies.
So how likely is that, you're asking? The conditions that would have to be met for that to happen would be, we would have to have leaders who prioritize that, who saw that as important, which means we have to have electorates who demand that from leaders. So that we have to have extraordinary great man style leaders.
Well, it's out because 43% of the U.S. electorates are idiots.
That might be, but that doesn't mean they'll necessarily be in power.
Yeah.
I think it is not out of the question, but it has to be raised to a higher level of public awareness.
That's always the case. Yeah.
How do other people answer that question?
Age-old problem with large groups of humans organizing themselves is most humans just want to live their lives and be with their families and do their work. Once an institution is set up, they stop watching it. And if that institution works pretty well, they stop worrying about it or paying attention to it. And then corruption sets in and it goes bad.
Yeah.
Or not even that. Sometimes you just get spoiled and you start demanding and expecting absurd things.
Yes.
Did you read the paragraph by Dean Acheson that I included in the newsletter? He said, we knew we had to create order out of chaos without blowing the world up. And that is what they did. So we have an example of a government saying, okay, we've got to create some order here without blowing things up. It has happened. But do we need a crisis on the order of the Second World War before anyone's motivated to do it?
Maybe.
Human nature.
I think the thing that will save us ultimately, as the great Eric Blair noticed all those years ago, if there's hope, it lies in the proles. I don't believe much. In fact, I try to avoid believing, focusing instead on what do I know. One of the difficulties in the current age is this epistemological crisis, which actually began on the left, with Derrida and Lacan and all those goofballs, and migrated to the right and ended up in Trumpism. So you get this problematization of truth that becomes post-truth. And you've got Occupy Wall Street, which seamlessly merges into the Tea Party. The moment in which we are living is a moment of incredible disorientation. This is something that I am mindful of constantly. And I see my work as trying to get through that as a journalist and as an observer, some class of public intellectual in Canada. But I do have a belief. I believe that most people are okay. I believe in the innate decency of most ordinary people. I may be wrong in that, but it's the way I was raised, and it's probably unshakable, so why bother even try? I do think that foreign policy and economic policy, immigration policy, resource development policy should be part of the same conversation.
Right.
And we tend to imagine that we can have our own principles and morals and values and somehow still engage in the fucking slave trade. And I don't believe that any good will come of this. And I think the more we engage people who are interested in knowing and people who are already engaged in one way or another, the better. I personally think we should take it away from people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and pretty well everybody else at Davos, by the way. That's where I'm coming from. I love everybody here. Thank you very much for putting up with me.
We love you too.
Thank you, Terry.
Love you, Terry. Love arguing with you.
You've also changed my mind about your prime minister's basic decency.
I'm sorry I was so mean.
No, you weren't mean.
Actually. See you, kids.
Bye.